She healed every broken bone in that kingdom, every poisoned wound, every shattered rib from border wars that should have killed better wolves than her. And when the prophecy demanded blood, when the sacred fire needed a throat to swallow whole, King Draven Ashthorne chose hers. This is the story of the woman who loved a king and the king who chained her to an altar. Stay with me until the end, because this one will rip your chest open and stitch it back wrong. Hit that like, drop your city in the comments, and let me know where my pack is watching from tonight. The throne room of Silverfang Keep smelled like old blood and cedar smoke. Not the pleasant kind that curled from winter hearths and reminded wolves of home. This was the stale, iron-laced stink of something rotting beneath marble floors, something the servants scrubbed every morning and could never quite kill. The chandeliers overhead, forged from blackened antler and war-claimed steel, threw jagged shadows across the vaulted ceiling, and every flicker of candlelight made the shadows twitch like living things pressed flat against stone. King Draven Ashthorne stood at the far end of the hall with both hands braced against the war table, his knuckles white, his jaw locked so tight the muscles in his neck corded like bridge cables. He had not slept in 4 days. His eyes, pale silver, the color all Ashthorne alphas carried like a birthright and a curse, were bloodshot and ringed with the bruised look of a man fighting something he could not claw or bite. Across the table, spread beneath bronze weights and half-melted candle stubs, lay a map of the 5 kingdoms. Every border was marked in red. Every red line was shrinking. "Say it again," Draven said. His voice came out low, scraped raw, the voice of a man who had been growling orders for hours and had nothing left but gravel. Lord Fenric Kane, first advisor to the crown, and the oldest wolf still breathing in the inner council, leaned forward in his chair. His silver hair fell past his shoulders in thin, oily ropes. His face was a topography of scars, 3 parallel gouges across his left cheek from a border skirmish 40 years dead, a notched ear, a jaw that had healed crooked after being broken twice. He smelled like pipe smoke and ambition. "The seers are unanimous, my king. The blood moon rises in 9 days. When it does, the veil of Ashara will crack, and the darkness sealed beneath it will pour into every territory, from the Grey Peak Mountains to the southern marshes. Every kingdom, every pack, every wolf who draws breath." Seers have been wrong before. Not 3 of them at once, not with the same vision down to the last detail. Fenric's voice was patient, the way a blade is patient. It did not rush, but it always cut. "The ruins at Ashara's gate are already waking. My scouts reported lights beneath the stones 2 nights ago. Lights that moved, lights that screamed." Draven's fingers curled against the table edge. He could feel his wolf pressing against the inside of his ribs, restless, furious, caged by duty and the suffocating weight of a crown he never asked to inherit. "And the ritual," Draven said. "Tell me about the ritual again." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Fenric exchanged a glance with Lady Sarath Voss, who sat in the shadows to his left like a spider who had learned to wear silk. She was the keeper of the old texts, the woman who maintained the kingdom's archive of ancient laws and forbidden knowledge. Her face betrayed nothing. It never did. "The rite of crimson binding," Sarath said, her voice cool and precise as a surgical instrument. "Older than the kingdoms themselves. Older than the wolf bloodlines. It was performed once, 700 years ago, when the darkness last threatened to breach the veil. The ritual requires a sacred altar, a lunar alignment, and a sacrifice of deep personal bond to the reigning alpha. The blood of the mate, given under the blood moon, renews the seal and forces the darkness back behind the veil for another age." Draven did not move, did not blink. The words hit him like stones dropped into still water, and the ripples spread through his chest in concentric rings of something he refused to name. "The blood of the mate," he repeated. "Your mate," Fenric clarified, and the old wolf's eyes were steady, unblinking, the eyes of a man who had already done the math and found the sum acceptable. Lyra Evermoon. The name landed in the room like a blade buried to the hilt in soft earth. Draven's hands trembled. He pressed them harder against the table until the trembling stopped, until the wood groaned under his grip, until the trembling transferred from his hands into the table itself and became something else entirely, No. My king. I said no. Then the 5 kingdoms burn, Fenric said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, no malice, just the flat arithmetic of survival spoken by a man who had outlived 3 kings and intended to outlive a 4th. Every wolf, every pup, every elder, every mate, and every healer, and every hunter who has ever sworn an oath to the Silver Fang crown. They all die because you could not do what every alpha before you understood, that the pack survives because the leader bleeds. You're asking me to kill my mate. I am asking you to save your kingdom. The distinction should have mattered. In the silence that followed, Draven was not sure it did. He turned away from the table and walked to the massive arched window that overlooked the kingdom below. Silver Fang City sprawled across the valley like a living thing. Smoke rising from 10,000 chimneys. Wolves moving through the streets in human form and wolf form. Children chasing each other between market stalls. Elders sitting on stone benches and watching the sky with the quiet unease of creatures who could smell change on the wind. His people. His responsibility. Every single one of them a thread in the web that held his sanity together. And somewhere in that city, in the small stone cottage near the eastern wall where the healers kept their herbs and their silence, Lyra was probably grinding willow bark and singing under her breath the way she always did when she thought no one was listening. How long? Draven said without turning around. How long would she? It is not a slow death, Sarath said. The altar takes the blood quickly. She would feel the blade, and then she would feel nothing. You speak as if that should comfort me. I speak as if 500,000 wolves are counting on you to think with your crown instead of your chest. Draven closed his eyes. Behind his lids, the darkness was not empty. It was full of Lyra's face. The way her brown eyes went soft and golden in firelight. The way her hands moved over wounds with a sureness that made even dying wolves go still. The way she laughed like she was surprised every single time that the world had offered her something worth laughing about. She was not a warrior. She was not a noble. She was the daughter of a border pack herbalist who had died in a raid when Lyra was 14, and she had walked into Silver Fang City 5 years ago with nothing but a satchel of dried roots and a talent for putting broken things back together. He had not meant to love her. Alphas of the Silver Fang crown did not mate with common healers. It was not done. It was not strategic. It was not anything that Fenric or Sarath or the entire snarling council of ambitious lords would have approved of, and he had done it anyway because the first time she touched his hand, just to check the pulse in his wrist during a routine examination, his wolf had gone so quiet and so still that for one impossible moment the war inside him stopped, and now they wanted her blood. "Leave me," Draven said. "My king, the blood moon, I said leave me." They left. Fenric and Sarath, and the 2 silent guards at the door, all of them filing out with the practiced obedience of wolves who knew when an alpha's voice carried the edge of something that would draw blood if pressed. The door closed. The latch fell. And Draven stood alone in the throne room of his ancestors and felt the floor tilt beneath him like the whole world had shifted on its axis and forgotten to tell him which direction was down. 9 days. He had 9 days to find another way. He did not find one. He searched the archives himself, spent 3 days buried in scrolls so old the parchment crumbled at his touch, reading by candlelight until his vision blurred and his wolf howled inside his skull with a grief that had no words. He summoned every scholar, every seer, every half-mad hermit who had ever claimed knowledge of the old magic. They all said the same thing. The rite of crimson binding was the only way. There were no alternatives. There were no loopholes. There was only the altar and the blade and the blood of the one soul bound closest to the Alpha's heart. On the 5th night, Lyra found him in the archives. She came in without knocking because she never knocked. It was one of the 1,000 small defiances that made her who she was, this quiet refusal to treat closed doors as anything more than suggestions. She wore a simple linen dress the color of faded sage, and her dark hair was pulled back in a loose braid that was already coming undone because her braids always came undone, because she moved through the world with a kind of careless grace that had no patience for things that required staying neat. "You look terrible," she said. Draven lifted his head from the scroll he had been staring at without reading for the last 20 minutes. His eyes were red. His jaw was dark with 5 days of stubble. He smelled like old paper and the sharp, acrid tang of a wolf whose body was burning through its own reserves. Lyra, you should not be here. You have not eaten today, or yesterday. Your guards are talking. She set a wooden tray on the table beside him. Bread, dried meat, a clay cup of something that smelled like the herbal tonic she brewed for wolves with sleeplessness. Eat. I am not hungry. I did not ask if you were hungry. I said eat. She pulled a chair from the opposite side of the table and sat down across from him with the directness of a woman who had spent her entire adult life telling wolves twice her size what to do with their bodies, and had never once flinched when they growled about it. What are you looking for? He could not look at her. The candlelight was doing the thing it always did to her face, catching the angles of her cheekbones, pooling gold in the hollows of her eyes, making her look like something carved from warm stone by hands that understood what mercy was supposed to look like. He could not look at her and think about altars and blades and the flat, clinical way Sarath had said she would feel the blade, and then she would feel nothing. Research, he said. Old laws. Nothing that concerns you. Everything about you concerns me. That is what it means to be your mate. The word hit him like a fist. Mate. The bond between them was a living thing. He could feel it even now, a silver thread strung between his ribs and hers, humming with her heartbeat, her warmth, her stubborn, unshakable faith in a man who was sitting in the dark, planning the exact method of her death. Lyra, he said, and his voice cracked on her name like thin ice over black water. If you had to choose between one life and a kingdom, what would you choose? She studied him. Her eyes, dark brown, almost black in this light, moved over his face with the diagnostic precision she applied to wounds, reading the inflammation beneath the surface, cataloging the damage that was not yet visible. That is not a real question, she said. No choice that simple ever exists. Humor me. I would choose neither. I would find a third option that everyone else was too tired or too afraid to look for. She reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were calloused from years of grinding herbs and stitching wounds and digging roots from frozen ground. They were not delicate fingers. They were the fingers of a woman who had earned every scar she carried. Draven, tell me what is happening. He should have told her. Every decent bone in his body, every shred of the honor he had been raised to carry like a second spine, screamed at him to open his mouth and speak the truth. She deserved that. She deserved to know the shape of the blade before it fell. But he looked at her face, and the words turned to ash on his tongue. And instead of the truth, he said, "It is nothing. Council business. The blood moon has everyone on edge." Lyra held his gaze for a long moment. Then she squeezed his hand and stood. "Eat," she said again. "Whatever it is, you cannot fight it if you are dead on your feet." She left. The door closed behind her, and Draven sat in the silence she left behind and felt something inside him begin to die. Not all at once, not with any dramatic rupture, but slowly, quietly, the way a wound closes over something that was never removed and poisons the blood from the inside out. On the 7th day, Lord Fenric called an emergency session of the High Council. Draven arrived to find the chamber already full, 14 lords and ladies of the great houses, each one commanding territory and troops and the kind of old blood loyalty that could make or break a king. They sat around the curved obsidian table like vultures around a carcass that had not yet stopped breathing. "The ruins at Ashar's gate have fully awakened," Fenric announced. "The stone circle is pulsing with dark energy. 3 scout teams have gone silent, and—" He paused. The pause was theatrical, but the fear beneath it was real. "The wolves in the eastern villages are reporting nightmares. The same nightmare. A shadow with teeth, rising from beneath the earth, swallowing the moon." Murmurs rippled through the council. Lord Brennan Greymaw, a thick-necked alpha from the northern territories who smelled like pine resin and barely contained violence, slammed his fist on the table. "Then do the damn ritual. We all know what needs to happen. Every hour we waste debating is another hour the darkness gets stronger." "The king has not yet authorized the rite," Fenric said, and the careful way he said it, neutral, factual, deliberately withholding judgment, was worse than an accusation. Every eye in the room turned to Draven. He sat at the head of the table with the stillness of a man who had been carved from the same obsidian as the table itself. His silver eyes moved across the faces of his council. Brennan's blunt fury, Fenric's patient calculation, Sarath's porcelain composure, Lady Maren Duskwield's barely concealed ambition, Lord Cassian Ironfell's quiet assessment. These were the wolves who kept the kingdom running. These were the wolves who would tear him from the throne if he failed them. "I need more time," Draven said. "You have 2 days," Brennan growled. 2 days before the blood moon rises, and whatever is sleeping under those ruins wakes up hungry. Your healer is 1 wolf, Draven. 1. Against 500,000. She is my mate, and my daughters live in the eastern village where wolves are screaming in their sleep. You want to talk to me about 1 life? The silence after that was a living thing with weight and teeth. Lady Maren spoke next, her voice silk drawn over a blade edge. Perhaps the king needs to be reminded that the crown exists to serve the many. Personal attachments, however deep, cannot supersede the survival of the realm. History remembers the kings who made the hard choices. It forgets the ones who could not. History also remembers the kings who slaughtered innocents and called it duty, Draven said, and his voice was so cold the candle flames on the table bent away from him like they were flinching. Do not lecture me about legacy, Maren. Your family built its legacy on the bones of border wolves you sacrificed in territory disputes and called it strategy. Maren's eyes flashed, but she inclined her head and said nothing more. 2 days, Fenric said, and his tone carried the gentle finality of a door closing. We will prepare the altar. If the king has not found an alternative by moonrise on the 9th night, the rite will proceed. The kingdom demands it. Draven left the council chamber and walked the corridors of Silverfang Keep until he found himself standing outside the healer's cottage. It was late. The moon was high and thin and sharp as a sickle blade, and the cottage windows glowed with the amber warmth of oil lamps. Through the cracked open door, he could hear Lyra's voice, low and steady, talking to someone. He pushed the door open. She was kneeling beside a pallet on the floor where a young wolf, a boy, no more than 16, lay shivering beneath a wool blanket. His face was gray, slicked with sweat, and his eyes were open but unseeing, locked on something that existed only behind his pupils. Lyra had one hand on his forehead and the other pressing a cloth soaked in something pungent against his chest. The nightmares, Draven said. Lyra did not look up. 12 cases today? Yesterday it was 3. He came in an hour ago screaming about a shadow that ate the sky. Her voice was level, professional, the voice of a healer who had learned long ago that panic was a luxury she could not afford. His wolf is trying to break free. I have him sedated, but the compound is not holding. Whatever is causing these dreams, it is not natural. Draven knelt beside her. The boy's skin was burning hot even through the blanket. His lips were moving, forming words too faint to hear, and Draven leaned closer and caught fragments. Darkness. Below. Teeth. It sees me. It sees me. It sees... Can you help him? I can keep him alive. I cannot stop whatever is feeding the nightmares. That is beyond my skill. She finally looked at Draven, and in her eyes he saw the thing she never showed her patience. The exhaustion, the doubt, the thin razor-wire edge of a woman holding together by sheer force of will. Draven, something is very wrong. I can feel it in the ground, in the air, in the way the wolves are reacting. Something old is waking up. I know. Then tell me what the council is planning. Do not lie to me again. Again. The word told him she had known. Of course she had known. She was a healer. She spent her life reading the bodies and faces of wolves who tried to hide their pain, and he had never been as good at hiding as he thought he was. The council wants a ritual, he said. An old rite. To seal the darkness back behind the veil before the blood moon breaks it open. What kind of ritual? He could not say it. The words were right there, lined up behind his teeth like soldiers waiting for an order, and he could not give the command. He looked at her face, her tired, beautiful, dirt-smudged face, and he could not say the words that would change the way she looked at him forever. A sacrifice, he said, of blood, close to the crown. Lyra was quiet for a long time. Her hand continued its steady motion on the boy's forehead, soothing, rhythmic, the mechanical comfort of a woman whose body knew how to heal even when her mind was reeling. "Whose blood?" she said. It was not a question. Draven did not answer. He did not have to. Something shifted in Lyra's eyes. A light going out, a door closing, a wall coming up brick by brick in real time. She pulled her hand from the boy's forehead and sat back on her heels and looked at Draven with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not fear. Something worse. Recognition. The look of a woman seeing clearly for the first time the exact shape of the cage she had been living in. "How long have you known?" she said. 7 days. 7 days. She stood. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steel. 7 days you have sat across from me, held my hand, let me bring you food and worry about your sleep, and the entire time you knew they were going to... She stopped, drew a breath. The breath shook. "Were you ever going to tell me, or were you just going to let me walk to that altar thinking it was a ceremony? I was looking for another way. I searched every archive, every text, every... Did you find one?" The silence was his answer. Lyra nodded once, a sharp downward jerk of her chin, and her eyes went bright and hard in a way that made her look like a completely different woman. Not the gentle healer, not the quiet mate, but something older and fiercer, something that had been sleeping beneath her skin and was only now lifting its head. "Then you have already decided," she said. "I have not... You are standing in my cottage at midnight. You could not look at me for 7 days. You have the expression of a man attending a funeral that has not happened yet." Her voice broke on the last word, and she pressed her lips together until it sealed. "You have decided, Draven. You just have not had the stomach to say it out loud. It is not that simple. It is exactly that simple. You are the king." "You say yes or you say no. And you came here tonight because you have already said yes in every room except this one." He reached for her. She stepped back. The distance between them, 3 feet of stone floor, felt like a canyon ripped open by tectonic force. "Lyra, do not touch me. Do not say my name like it still means something to you while you are planning to spill my blood on sacred stone." Her eyes were wet now, but no tears fell. She held them like she held everything wet, with the quiet, brutal discipline of a woman who had learned early that falling apart was something other people could afford. "I healed your warriors. I healed your people. I held the hands of dying wolves and told them it would be all right when we both knew it would not be. I gave everything I had to this kingdom, and this is what the kingdom gives back. It is not the kingdom. It is me. I take the responsibility." "Good. Then take it honestly. Look me in the eyes and say the words." Draven looked at her. The candlelight shivered between them. Somewhere outside, a wolf howled, long, low, aching, the sound of an animal that could smell something terrible on the wind and had no language for it except grief. "The rite of crimson binding requires the blood of the alpha's mate," Draven said, and each word fell from his mouth like a stone dropped from a great height. "I have searched for every alternative. There are none. In 2 days, the blood moon rises, and if the seal is not renewed, every wolf in the 5 kingdoms dies. I am choosing the kingdom, Lyra, and I will carry the cost of that choice for the rest of my life." Lyra stared at him. A single tear broke free and tracked down her left cheek, cutting a line through the dust on her skin. She did not wipe it away. "The cost," she said quietly. "You speak of cost like this is a ledger, like my life is a number you can write off and balance against a larger sum." She shook her head. "You do not even understand what you are losing, Draven. You think you are losing a mate. You think you are losing a healer. But there is something older inside me, something I have felt stirring for weeks, something I cannot name, something that wakes me in the night with silver light behind my eyes and the taste of starfire on my tongue. And you are going to slaughter it on an altar because a council of ambitious wolves told you there was no other way, and you believed them because believing them was easier than fighting them." The words hit Draven like a physical blow. He stepped back. His wolf surged against his ribcage, howling, clawing, screaming with an urgency he had never felt before. Not the rage of battle or the territorial fury of a challenged alpha, but something deeper, something primal, the bone-deep recognition that he was about to make a mistake so catastrophic it would echo through centuries. But the boy on the pallet was still shivering. And somewhere in the eastern villages, children were screaming in their sleep. And the darkness beneath Ashara's gate was pulsing like a second heartbeat, growing stronger with every hour, and Draven could feel it even here. A pressure behind his eyes, a weight in his chest, the slow gravitational pull of something ancient and hungry and patient. "I'm sorry," he said. "Sorry does not stop the blade." He left the cottage. The door closed behind him. And Lyra stood alone in the amber light with a dying boy at her feet and the sound of her own heartbeat filling the room like a war drum counting down to 0. On the 9th night, they came for her. 4 of the king's personal guard, wolves she had healed, wolves whose wounds she had stitched and whose fevers she had broken, arrived at her cottage door an hour before moonrise. They would not meet her eyes. They carried chains forged from moonsilver, the sacred metal that could bind even an alpha, and when Lyra opened the door and saw what they carried, she did not scream. She did not fight. She looked at each of them in turn with those dark, steady eyes, and then she held out her wrists. "At least have the decency to walk me through the front gate," she said. "If the kingdom is going to watch me die, they can watch me walk there on my own legs." They chained her. The moonsilver burned where it touched her skin, faintly at first, then brighter, then with a searing white heat that made the guards exchange uneasy glances. Moonsilver was not supposed to react to common wolves. It was not supposed to glow. It was not supposed to hum with a low, vibrating frequency that rattled teeth and made the hair stand up on the back of every neck within 20 feet. Lyra felt it too. The burning was not pain, or not only pain. It was something beneath the pain, something being stirred awake, something that had been sleeping in her blood for longer than she had been alive. Silver light flickered at the edges of her vision. Her pulse slowed. Her breathing deepened. And for one brief, disorienting moment, she was not Lyra Evermoon standing in chains outside a cottage in Silverfang City. She was someone else entirely, someone standing on a cliff above a vast dark ocean, with the moon hanging so close she could touch it, and a voice like silver bells was saying her name. Not Lyra. Another name. A name that meant light and seal and sacrifice and choice. The moment passed. She was back in her body, in her chains, being led through streets lined with silent wolves who watched her pass with expressions ranging from grief to guilt to the blank, dissociative stare of creatures who had decided that looking away was the same as not being responsible. The altar stood in the center of the proving grounds, the vast stone amphitheater where kings were crowned and traitors were executed. And the great rituals of the Silverfang kingdom had been performed since before the first Ashthorne took the throne. It was carved from a single block of black stone veined with silver, and tonight it pulsed with a faint, sickly luminescence that made it look like something alive, something breathing, something waiting. The entire kingdom had gathered. 10,000 wolves filled the amphitheater, standing shoulder to shoulder in the tiered stone seats, their faces lit by torchlight and the thin, sharp edge of the rising moon. The sky above was wrong. The stars seemed too bright, too close, and the moon itself was tinged with red at its edges, like a wound beginning to bleed. Draven stood beside the altar in his ceremonial armor, black leather and moonsilver, the crown of the Ashthorne line heavy on his brow. His face was a mask. His eyes were dead. He looked like a man who had already walked through fire and come out the other side as something less than what he had been. Fenric stood to his left, holding the ceremonial blade, a curved, ancient thing with runes etched into its steel that seemed to writhe and shift in the torchlight. Sarath stood to his right, her hands folded, her expression serene with the practiced calm of a woman who had choreographed every detail of this moment down to the placement of the torches. They brought Lyra forward. The crowd parted for her like water around a stone, and the silence was so complete that every footstep on the stone floor sounded like a gunshot. She walked with her spine straight, her chin level, her eyes fixed on some point above the crowd where the sky was darkest. The chains clinked with each step. The moon silver still glowed against her skin, brighter now, casting her face in silver light that made her look ethereal, otherworldly, like something too luminous to belong to this place of blood and stone. They chained her to the altar. Her back against the cold black stone, her arms spread, the moon-silver links driven into iron rings that had been set into the altar 700 years ago for exactly this purpose. She did not struggle. She did not beg. She stood there and looked at Draven with eyes that held no hatred and no forgiveness and no fear. Only a vast, exhausted clarity, the clarity of a woman who had finally stopped hoping and started seeing. Draven took the blade from Fenric's hands. The weight of it was nothing. The weight of everything else was crushing. "Begin," Fenric said. Draven stepped forward. The crowd held its breath. 10,000 wolves, 10,000 hearts, 10,000 sets of lungs, all frozen in the same suspended moment between before and after. And then the sky tore open. Not gradually, not with warning. One moment the blood moon was a disk of dull crimson hanging above the amphitheater, and the next it cracked like an egg, and something poured through. Not light, not darkness, but something between, something that was both and neither, a writhing, screaming absence of everything that made the world make sense. The ancient ruins beyond the city walls erupted with columns of black fire. The ground shook. The altar beneath Lyra's back blazed with blinding silver light. And ancient symbols, symbols that had not been visible on the stone for 7 centuries, ignited beneath her body like a language being spoken for the first time in an age. Lyra screamed, not in pain, in recognition. The memories hit her like a tidal wave. Not her memories, not the memories of a healer's daughter from a border pack, but the memories of something vast and ancient and luminous. A goddess standing at the edge of creation, pressing her palms against a wound in the fabric of the world, sealing the darkness behind a wall of pure moonlight, pouring her own essence into the seal until there was nothing left of her divinity, and she fell, diminished, into the mortal cycle to be born and reborn and forgotten. She saw it all. She felt it all. The weight of centuries pressed against her skull, and she opened her mouth, and the sound that came out was not a scream but a word in a language that had not been spoken since before the wolf bloodlines existed, a word that meant, "I remember." The chains shattered. Moon-silver fragments exploded outward like shrapnel, and where Lyra had been, the quiet healer, the common wolf, the woman they had chained to a slaughter stone, something else stood. Silver light poured from her skin. Her eyes blazed white gold. Her hair lifted around her head like she was submerged in water made of starlight, and the altar beneath her feet cracked down the middle as power older than the kingdoms themselves erupted from the body of a woman who had never known what she carried. Above them, through the wound in the sky, the shadow descended, massive, formless, a darkness with weight and hunger and intelligence, with eyes like dying stars and a mouth that opened across half the horizon. The ancient beast sealed behind the veil of Ashara, the thing the prophecy had warned about, was free, and it was looking directly at Lyra. Draven dropped the blade. It clattered against the stone, and the sound was lost in the roar of the crowd, breaking into chaos. Wolves screaming, shifting, trampling each other to flee the amphitheater as the shadow beast descended, and the ground cracked and the sky bled. He lunged toward Lyra, but the silver light surrounding her threw him back like a physical force, and he hit the ground hard enough to taste blood. Through the chaos, through the screaming and the darkness and the shattering world, Fenric's voice cut like a knife. Not panicked, not afraid, but sharp with something that sounded horribly like satisfaction. "It worked," Fenric said, and he was not talking to Draven. He was talking to Serath, and Serath was smiling. The awakening worked. The prophecy was never about sealing the darkness. It was about releasing it, and releasing her. Draven turned, the blood drained from his face, and in that moment, with the shadow beast descending, with Lyra blazing like a fallen star on the broken altar, with the kingdom tearing itself apart around him, he understood with perfect, devastating clarity that everything he had been told was a lie. The prophecy was manufactured. The ritual was a trigger. And the woman he had just tried to sacrifice was the only force in existence capable of stopping what he had just helped unleash. Lyra's blazing eyes locked onto his across the burning amphitheater, and in them he saw something that cut deeper than any blade. Not anger, not power, not divine fury, but the quiet, shattered recognition of a woman who finally understood what she was and what it had cost her to find out. The shadow beast opened its mouth, the sky went black, and the last thing Draven heard before the darkness swallowed everything was Lyra's voice. Not the gentle voice of the healer, but something older, something vast, something that shook the foundations of the world, speaking a single sentence that split the night like lightning. "You were supposed to protect me." Then the darkness hit, and the world went silent. The darkness lasted 3 heartbeats. 3 heartbeats of absolute nothing. No sound, no light, no air, just the crushing weight of something ancient pressing down on every living thing in the amphitheater like a fist closing around the world's throat. Then the silver light exploded outward from Lyra's body and punched a hole through the blackness, and the world came roaring back in fragments. Screaming wolves, crumbling stone, the wet crack of the amphitheater's eastern wall splitting from foundation to parapet. Draven hit the ground rolling and came up on his feet with his claws already extended, his wolf surging to the surface so fast his vision split. One eye human, one eye predator, the world overlapping in layered shades of heat and motion and threat. Blood ran from a gash above his left eyebrow where a chunk of the altar had caught him. He could not feel it. He could not feel anything except the bond, the mate bond, screaming in his chest like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Lyra stood at the center of the ruined altar, and she was not Lyra anymore. Not entirely. The silver light that poured from her skin had shape now, form, and it moved around her like living armor, like wings folded tight against her back, like the memory of something divine compressed into a body that was too small to hold it. Her eyes were open, but they were not her eyes. They were white gold, pupilless, blazing with a light that cast no shadows because it came from everywhere at once. Above her, the shadow beast coiled against the bleeding sky like smoke given mass and malice. It had no fixed shape. It shifted constantly. Now a serpent, now a wolf with too many heads, now something with no name and no anatomy, just hunger given geometry. Its eyes, if they were eyes, burned like collapsed stars, and when it opened its mouth, the sound that came out was not a roar, but a frequency, a vibration that hit the bones directly and made every wolf in the amphitheater drop to their knees. Every wolf except Draven. He stood because standing was the only thing left, because his mate was burning alive with power she did not understand, and a beast older than history was descending on his kingdom, and the 2 wolves he had trusted most, Fenric and Serath, were standing 20 yards away looking at the apocalypse they had engineered with the calm satisfaction of architects watching a building rise. Draven covered the distance in 4 strides. He seized Fenric by the throat and slammed the old wolf against the amphitheater wall hard enough to crack the stone behind his skull. "Talk," Draven said. "Now, or I tear your head off and ask Serath instead." Fenric's scarred face twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. Blood seeped from beneath his silver hair where his skull had met the wall. His hands came up, not to fight, not to claw, but to rest almost gently on Draven's wrist, the way a man might touch a railing while admiring a view. "You would not believe me if I told you. Try." The prophecy was real, Draven, every word of it, the blood moon, the darkness, the breach in the veil, all real. What was not real was the solution we gave you. Fenric's voice was steady despite the hand crushing his windpipe. Decades of court politics had taught him to speak clearly under pressure. The rite of crimson binding does not seal the darkness. It never did. It is a key. A very specific key designed to do 2 things simultaneously: crack the veil and awaken whatever sleeps inside the bloodline of the one who is sacrificed. You wanted the beast to break free. I wanted the goddess to wake up. The beast breaking free was a necessary consequence. Draven's grip tightened. Fenric's eyes bulged slightly, but his expression did not change. You used me. I guided you. There is a difference. There is no difference when the result is my mate chained to an altar. Your mate is currently the most powerful being on this continent. You are welcome. Draven threw him. Fenric hit the ground and skidded across broken stone, and 2 of the royal guard moved toward him but stopped when Draven's eyes locked on them. Silver, blazing, the eyes of an alpha whose authority came not from the crown on his head, but from the primal, marrow-deep certainty that he could kill every wolf in this amphitheater, and they all knew it. "Serath," Draven said. She had not moved. The chaos around her, the fleeing wolves, the crumbling walls, the shadow beast writhing against the sky, seemed to exist at a distance from her, as though she occupied a slightly different version of reality where everything was going exactly according to plan. "My king! How long? How long have you and Fenric been planning this? Longer than you have been alive." The words landed like a blade between his ribs. "Your father knew," Serath continued, and her voice carried the precise, unhurried cadence of a woman who had been waiting decades for this conversation. Not the details, but he knew the veil was weakening. He knew the darkness would return within a generation, and he knew that the only force capable of stopping it was the moon goddess reborn, but that her power could only be triggered by a specific combination of mortal trauma, sacred ground, and lunar alignment. The rite of crimson binding was not a solution. It was a detonator. "My father would never, Your father did exactly what you did. He chose the kingdom. He spent 20 years searching for the reincarnation, and when his scouts identified Lyra, an orphaned healer with lunar-sensitive blood and no knowledge of her own nature, he arranged for her to be placed in your path. Your meeting was not fate, Draven. It was logistics." The ground shifted beneath him, not from the earthquake, not from the shadow beast's presence, but from the internal collapse of every foundation he had built his life on. His father had known. His advisors had known. His entire relationship with Lyra, the meeting, the courtship, the bond, had been engineered by dead men and patient conspirators who needed an alpha stupid enough to love a woman and desperate enough to sacrifice her. "You are lying. I am the keeper of the old texts. Lying is beneath my function." Serath tilted her head slightly. "The question you should be asking is not whether I am lying. The question is whether it matters. The goddess is awake. The beast is free. And in approximately 6 minutes, that creature is going to finish orienting itself and begin consuming every living thing between here and the Grey Peak Mountains. What you do in those 6 minutes determines whether your kingdom survives the night." A massive concussion shook the amphitheater. The shadow beast had descended lower, close enough now that its presence was a physical thing, a pressure wave that flattened torches and made the stone beneath their feet vibrate like a struck bell. Wolves were still fleeing through every exit, a stampede of fur and terror, and in the crush Draven could see bodies going down, could hear the sharp yelps of wolves trampled by their own pack, his people, dying because he had been too blind to see the trap and too weak to question the wolves who set it. He turned back toward the altar. Lyra, or the thing that Lyra was becoming, still stood at its center, wreathed in silver fire, her head tilted back and her lips moving silently as though she was having a conversation with something no one else could hear. The power radiating from her was immense, tidal, the kind of force that bent the air around it and made reality flex at the edges. But her hands were shaking, her body was shaking. She was a healer's daughter from a border pack, and the power of a goddess was tearing through her like lightning through wet wood, and she was burning. Draven ran to her. The silver light hit him like a wall. Heat, pressure, the electric taste of something that was not quite energy and not quite matter. And it pushed against him, pushed hard, pushed with the force of a woman who had been betrayed by the man running toward her, and whose power now reflected that betrayal as a physical barrier. But Draven pushed back. He put his head down and his shoulders forward, and he drove into the light the way he had driven into enemy lines during the border wars, with nothing but forward momentum and the refusal to stop. He reached her. The light burned his skin, blisters rising on his forearms, his neck, his face. But he reached her, and he grabbed her hands, and the moment his skin touched hers, the bond between them flared so bright it was visible, a silver cord strung between their chests, vibrating with every heartbeat, every breath, every unspoken word that had accumulated between them like sediment in still water. "Lyra, look at me." Her eyes, those terrible, beautiful, inhuman eyes, turned toward him. There was recognition in them, buried deep beneath the light and the power and the centuries of memory that were flooding through her. She knew him. She knew what he had done, and she was looking at him the way a drowning woman looks at the hand that pushed her under. "You do not get to be here," she said, and her voice was layered. Her voice and something older, something that resonated in frequencies the human ear was not built to process. "You do not get to hold my hands after you sharpen the blade." "I know." "Then why are you here?" "Because you are going to burn. I can feel it through the bond. This power is too much for your body, and it is tearing you apart from the inside, and if someone does not anchor you to something human, you are going to lose yourself entirely, and the goddess will be all that is left." Maybe that is what should happen. Maybe. But I'm not going to stand here and watch it. You are going to stand here and watch me die. The words hit him so hard his knees buckled. He did not let go of her hands. "Yes," he said, "I was. And that is the worst thing I have ever done. And I do not have enough years left in my life to earn forgiveness for it, and I am not asking. I am asking you to let me help you survive the next 6 minutes. After that, you can hate me for the rest of eternity. I will deserve every second of it." The shadow beast screamed. The sound was not a sound, it was an erasure, a void where sound should have been, and it hit the amphitheater like a shockwave and took out what remained of the eastern wall in a cascade of rubble and dust. Through the gap in the wall, Draven could see Silverfang City, his home, the 10,000 chimneys and market stalls and stone houses that held every life he was responsible for. And the shadow was reaching toward it with tendrils of darkness that moved like fingers, like roots, like the slow, inevitable spread of something that consumed everything it touched. Lyra's grip on his hands tightened. Her burning eyes looked past him, toward the city, toward the wolves still running in the streets below, toward the children she had healed and the elders whose hands she had held, and the endless parade of broken bodies she had stitched back together because that was who she was. Not a goddess, not a weapon, not a key or a detonator or a piece in someone else's strategy, but a healer who could not watch people suffer without reaching out. "The seal," she said. "I can feel where the old seal was. I can feel the shape of it, but the power, I cannot control it. It is like trying to hold an ocean in my hands." "Then do not hold it alone." "The bond between us is damaged, Draven. You damaged it. It cannot carry enough. Then I will carry what the bond cannot." He did not know what that meant until he did it. He pulled on the bond, not gently, not carefully, but with everything he had, every shred of the Alpha's power that lived in his blood and his bones, and the marrow of his ancestral line. He opened the bond like a floodgate and poured himself through it. Not his strength, not his authority, but his self, the raw, unfiltered totality of who he was, every memory, every fear, every moment of weakness he had hidden behind the mask of the king. He gave her the night he had sat alone in the archives and wept. He gave her the morning he had found her singing in the healer's cottage and stood outside the door for 20 minutes because the sound of her voice made his wolf go quiet, and he had not wanted to break the spell. He gave her the precise moment he had decided to sacrifice her. Not the decision itself, but the exact quality of the despair that had driven it, the taste of it, the weight, the way it had felt like swallowing broken glass and calling it duty. Lyra gasped. The silver light around her shifted, from cold and explosive to something warmer, something that pulsed instead of blazed, something that had rhythm and direction and purpose. Her eyes flickered, white gold to brown to white gold again. And in the flickering he saw her fighting, saw the healer wrestling with the goddess for control of a body that belonged to both of them and neither of them. "I can see the seal," she said, and now her voice was hers again, shaking, human, terrified and determined in equal measure. "I can see where it broke, but to restore it I need to get closer. I need to be at the breach point, at Ashara's gate. That is 3 miles from here." Then we run. Behind them, the shadow beast finished its slow descent and touched the ground for the first time. Where it landed, the center of the proving grounds, the exact spot where the altar had stood, the stone did not break. It disappeared, ceased to exist, left behind a void of absolute nothing, a hole in the world shaped like hunger, and the void began to spread. Draven looked at the spreading void, looked at the city, looked at Lyra. "Fenric," he called without turning around. You orchestrated this. You knew what was coming. Tell me you have a plan for the beast while we reach the gate." Fenric's voice came from somewhere in the rubble, strained but steady. "The beast cannot be killed, only resealed. All I can offer you is time, and not much of it." "How much?" "The royal guard and the great houses can engage it, slow it, lead it east toward the ruins where the veil is thinnest, perhaps 20 minutes before it consumes everything in its path. 20 minutes to cover 3 miles and perform a ritual that has not been done in 7 centuries. I never said the plan was comfortable." Draven's jaw clenched until his teeth ached. Then he turned to the remnants of the royal guard, battered, bloodied, but still standing because that was what they had been bred and trained and broken to do. And he spoke with the voice of a king giving what might be the last order of his reign. "Hold the line. Buy us time. Whatever it costs." Captain Rowan Ashville, a scarred female alpha with one working eye and the disposition of a warhammer, slammed her fist against her chest. "What are we holding against, my king?" Draven looked at the void where the altar had been. It was wider now, the size of a house, growing. "Everything," he said. Rowan grinned. The tight, joyless grin of a wolf who had made peace with dying a long time ago and had been waiting for a death worth the trouble. She turned to her guards. "You heard the king. Form up. Anyone who runs, I kill myself. Anyone who stands, I will buy you a drink in whatever comes after." Draven grabbed Lyra's hand. Her skin was still hot, still luminous, still trembling with power that flickered between divine and desperate. She looked at him with eyes that held no trust and no softness and no forgiveness, only the raw, practical calculation of a woman who understood that survival sometimes meant running beside the man who had tried to kill you. They ran. Behind them, the shadow beast roared, that void sound, that erasure, and the royal guard of Silverfang Kingdom charged directly into the mouth of something that could unmake reality, because their king told them to. Because holding the line was the only language they knew. Because sometimes the only answer to the impossible was to stand in front of it and refuse to move. And 3 miles east, beyond the burning city and the crumbling walls and the wolves dying to buy time they might not have, Ashar's gate waited. Ancient, pulsing, cracked wide open like a wound in the world's foundation. The breach point. The place where the veil had been sealed 700 years ago by a goddess who had burned herself down to mortal nothing to save a world that would forget her name. She was going back, and the man who betrayed her was the only thing standing between her and the darkness that wanted to make sure she never arrived. Lyra ran faster. The silver light trailed behind her like a comet's tail, and inside her chest, 2 heartbeats fought for dominance, the healer's steady, stubborn rhythm and the goddess's ancient, thundering pulse. And she did not know which one would be beating when she reached the gate. She was not sure it mattered anymore. Either way, she was done being the sacrifice. This time, she would be the blade. They covered the first mile through burning streets. Silverfang City was tearing itself apart, buildings collapsing inward as the void at the proving grounds expanded, pulling matter toward it like a drain swallowing water. Wolves ran in every direction, some in human form carrying children, others fully shifted and sprinting blind with terror, their paws slipping on cobblestones slicked with ash and the black, oily residue that the shadow beast left on everything it touched. The air tasted like scorched metal, and something older, something that had no taste because it predated the concept of flavor, the chemical signature of a force that existed before the world learned how to be a world. Draven ran ahead, clearing the path. His wolf was fully surfaced now, not shifted but pressed so close to his skin that his movements were no longer entirely human, faster, sharper, angled with the predatory efficiency of a creature built to cover ground and eliminate obstacles. Twice he shouldered through collapsed doorways. Once, he caught a falling timber beam one-handed and held it long enough for a cluster of fleeing wolves to scramble beneath it, and the tendons in his forearm screamed and his shoulder joint ground bone against bone, and he did not slow down. Lyra ran behind him. The silver light around her had dimmed to a low, flickering pulse, conserving itself, and she moved with a strange, dual gait. Sometimes the careful, grounded stride of a healer navigating rough terrain, sometimes something longer and more fluid, as though her body was remembering a different way of moving, a way that belonged to something that had once walked between stars. Her breathing was ragged. Sweat cut tracks through the ash on her face. The goddess memories were still flooding her in waves. She would stumble, catch herself, and for a split second her eyes would go white gold and distant as another century's worth of knowledge crashed through her skull, like surf against rock. She did not speak to Draven. She did not look at him. She ran beside the shape of his betrayal and used his body as a windbreak against the heat and the ash and the pragmatism of it, the cold, surgical decision to use the man who had tried to kill her as a tool for her own survival was its own kind of armor. They hit the eastern gate at a dead sprint. The massive iron doors, forged during the First Wolf War, thick enough to stop a battering ram, stood open, torn from their hinges by the shockwave that had rippled outward when the shadow beast touched ground. Beyond the gate, the road to Ashara's gate wound through dense forest, climbing steadily toward the ridgeline where the ancient ruins stood. Draven stopped, his chest heaved. Blood from the gash above his eye had dried in a dark crust that cracked every time he blinked. The forest road is the fastest route. 20 minutes if we push hard. I know the road, Lyra said. Her voice was flat, stripped of everything except information. I collected moonroot along it every autumn. The path narrows at the river crossing. If anything is waiting for us, that is where it will be. She was right. She was always right about terrain. The healer's eye for landscape, the forager's memory for paths and choke points. Draven had once found that knowledge charming. Now it felt like another reminder of everything he had failed to see about the woman he claimed to know. They entered the forest. The canopy overhead blocked what remained of the sky, and the only light came from Lyra's flickering silver glow and the distant red pulse of the blood moon filtering through the leaves like diluted blood. The trees here were old, massive ironwoods with trunks wider than a wolf's body length, their roots breaking through the forest floor in gnarled ridges that could snap an ankle if you stepped wrong in the dark. The shadows between the trees moved, not from wind, from something else, something watching. Draven's wolf caught the scent first, not the shadow beast. This was different. Wolf scent. Multiple wolves. And beneath the wolf musk, the sharp chemical edge of adrenaline spiked with something deliberate, something controlled. The scent of wolves who were not fleeing, wolves who were waiting. He stopped, extended one arm to halt Lyra behind him, every muscle in his body locked. "We have company," he said. They came from the trees like they had been grown there. 12 wolves in human form, armed with moon-silver blades and crossbows fitted with bolts tipped in the same sacred metal. They moved in a tactical spread, covering angles, blocking the path forward and the path back with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had drilled this exact formation 100 times. Their faces were painted with dark ash, not war paint, but concealment, the markings of wolves who did not want to be identified. But Draven recognized the formation. He recognized the blade work. He recognized the way the lead wolf held her crossbow, high and angled, the stock braced against her collarbone instead of her shoulder, the signature stance of the Dusk-Wheeled Hunting Company. "Marin," Draven said. Lady Marin Dusk-Wheeled stepped forward from the center of the formation. She had shed her court silks for field leather, and the transformation was striking. The polished noblewoman replaced by something leaner, harder, a wolf who had been wearing civilization like a costume and had finally stripped it off. Her crossbow was aimed at Lyra's chest. "My king," Marin said. The title carried no deference. It was a formality, a label, the kind of word you used for a position rather than a person. "I need you to step away from the healer. Lower the crossbow, Marin." "I cannot do that." That was not a request. And this is not a negotiation. Marin's eyes flicked to Lyra, to the silver light pulsing beneath her skin, to the white gold that flickered in her irises. The awakening worked. The goddess blood is active. But Fenric and Serath made a critical miscalculation. They assumed the goddess would be controllable, that she would simply reseal the veil like a good weapon and go back to sleep. They were wrong. How do you know what Fenric assumed? Because I have been part of this operation for 6 years, Draven. Since before Lyra set foot in Silverfang City, since before your father died. Marin's voice was steady, clinical, the voice of a woman delivering a briefing rather than a betrayal. Your father started this. Fenric and Sereth refined it, and I provided the resources, the scouts who identified Lyra, the agents who arranged for her border pack to be raided so she would have nowhere to go but Silverfang, the diplomatic channels that kept the other kingdoms from interfering while we positioned the pieces. The words hit Draven like individual blows, each one landing in a different part of his chest, each one cracking something that had already been fractured by Sereth's revelation at the amphitheater. Lyra's pack had not been raided by bandits. It had been raided by Marin's agents. Lyra's parents had not died in a random border conflict. They had been murdered to create an orphan, to manufacture a refugee, to produce a lonely, displaced healer who would walk into Silverfang City with no family, no protection, and no knowledge that she was anything more than common. Behind him, Lyra made a sound. Not a gasp, not a cry. Something quieter, something worse. The sound of a woman absorbing a blow so deep it bypassed pain entirely and went straight to the structural level, the level where identity lives, the level where a person's understanding of their own history either holds or collapses. My parents, Lyra said. 2 words, flat as stone. Necessary casualties, Marin said, and the ease with which she said it, the absolute absence of hesitation or apology, revealed more about the architecture of this conspiracy than any confession could. These were not wolves who had made difficult choices. These were wolves who had stopped recognizing certain choices as difficult a long time ago. The timeline required your isolation. An orphaned healer with lunar-sensitive blood, no pack ties, no protection, no one to ask uncomfortable questions about why the king's scouts kept showing up in the same village. Your parents were obstacles. We removed them. Lyra's silver light flared. Not the controlled pulse of the last hour, but something raw and jagged, a surge of power driven by emotion rather than intent, and the air around her crackled and the nearest trees groaned as their trunks bent away from her like they were trying to flee. Her hands were shaking, her jaw was locked, and in her eyes, those flickering half-divine eyes, Draven saw something he had never seen in Lyra before. Not anger, rage. The pure, annihilating rage of a woman who had just learned that every tragedy in her life had been scheduled. Why are you telling me this? Draven said, forcing his voice level, forcing his wolf to hold position when every instinct screamed to attack. 12 soldiers, moon-silver weapons, crossbows at close range. The math was not in his favor. Because Fenric and Sereth want to use the goddess to seal the veil. That was always their plan. Awaken the divine power. Point it at the breach, let it burn itself out, restoring the seal. Elegant, simple, and catastrophically short-sighted. Marin's crossbow did not waver. The goddess blood is not a tool. It is a force. If it fully integrates with the host, with Lyra, the result is not a healer with divine power. The result is a new moon goddess walking the earth in physical form. An entity powerful enough to reshape the 5 kingdoms. Powerful enough to overthrow every alpha, every throne, every power structure that has kept the great houses in control for 7 centuries. And you cannot allow that. I cannot allow that. The great houses cannot allow that. The balance of power between the kingdoms depends on the wolf bloodlines maintaining dominance. A living goddess answers to no alpha. She answers to no council. She answers to nothing except her own judgment, and we have no guarantee that her judgment will align with our interests. The calculation was naked, stripped of every pretense, every layer of patriotism and duty and save the kingdom rhetoric. This was what the conspiracy had always been about. Not saving the 5 kingdoms from darkness, not awakening a savior. Control. The great houses had spent decades engineering this moment because they wanted a weapon they could fire and discard, a goddess who would seal the veil and then conveniently burn out, leaving the existing power structure intact, and the nobles who had orchestrated the whole thing positioned as saviors of the realm. Lyra was not supposed to survive. She was never supposed to survive. So you are here to finish what the altar started, Draven said. Different method, same body on the ground. The moon silver bolts are designed to disrupt divine energy. 3 bolts to the chest will fragment the goddess blood, force it to disperse. The host dies. The power scatters, and the seal gets restored through residual energy discharge rather than directed will. Messy, but functional. Marin's eyes were flat, professional. The eyes of a woman who had already categorized murder as project management. The beast still gets sealed, the kingdoms still survive, and the balance of power remains exactly where it has been for 700 years. In your hands. In responsible hands. Draven looked at the 12 wolves surrounding them, soldiers, trained killers, each one carrying moon silver capable of disrupting the only force that could stop the shadow beast from consuming every living thing on the continent. And behind them, invisible but present, the vast machinery of a conspiracy that stretched back decades. His father, Fenric, Sarath, Marin, and who knew how many others, all of them pulling strings, sacrificing lives, dismantling a girl's entire world piece by piece to produce a weapon they could aim and break. His wolf was howling inside him, and for the first time in his life, Draven listened to what the howl was actually saying. Not fight, not protect, not avenge. The howl was saying, choose. Choose who you are when every throne and title and inheritance and expectation is stripped away. Choose who you are when the crown is just metal and the kingdom is just a word, and the only thing left is the raw, undecorated truth of what you are willing to do and what you are willing to become. He had been a king who sacrificed his mate to save his kingdom. He had been a puppet whose love was engineered by conspirators. He had been a fool and a weapon and a pawn, and every identity he had ever worn, alpha, king, protector, leader, had been a costume fitted by other hands. So he stopped being any of them. He moved. Not with the calculated precision of a king or the political restraint of a ruler weighing consequences. He moved with the raw, stripped-down brutality of a wolf who had burned through every civilized layer and found something underneath that did not negotiate, did not posture, did not calculate acceptable losses. He hit the nearest soldier before the crossbow could track, drove his claws through the wolf's weapon arm, caught the falling crossbow with his other hand, and put the bolt through a second soldier's thigh in a single fluid motion that he did not plan because planning was a luxury for wolves who had not already lost everything worth losing. Marin fired. The moon-silver bolt sang through the air toward Lyra's chest and stopped. Frozen in mid-air, 6 inches from Lyra's sternum, caught in a field of silver light that hardened around it like amber around an insect. Lyra's hand was raised. Her eyes were full white gold now, no brown left, no healer left, nothing but the ancient, terrible awareness of something that had been sleeping for 7 centuries and had just been told that the people who murdered its host's parents were standing 20 feet away asking for its cooperation. The bolt reversed. Not thrown, redirected, as though gravity had simply decided to change its mind about which direction was down. It flew back along its own trajectory and buried itself in Marin's crossbow, splitting the weapon in half with a crack that echoed through the forest like a bone breaking. The remaining soldiers hesitated. That hesitation was the last luxury they were afforded. Draven was among them now, a blur of claws and elbows, and the kind of close-quarters violence that could not be trained into a wolf, but had to be unlocked through the systematic destruction of every restraint that kept an alpha civil. He did not kill them. He broke their weapons, their wrists, their stances, dismantled their formation with the efficiency of a man who understood tactical geometry intimately because he had designed half the formations they were using. 18 seconds, 12 soldiers down, not dead but done. Groaning, clutching shattered hands, staring at a king who had just moved through them like weather. Marin was on her knees, her ruined crossbow beside her, blood running from a gash across her palm where the moon-silver shrapnel had cut her. She looked up at Draven with an expression that was not fear, but reassessment, the cold, analytical recalculation of a woman encountering a variable she had not accounted for. "You cannot protect her forever," Marin said. "Even if you reach the gate, even if she seals the veil. The great houses will not accept a living goddess. They will send armies. They will send assassins. They will tear this kingdom apart before they allow one woman to hold that much power unchecked. Then I will tear the great houses apart first." The words came out of him without thought, without calculation, without any awareness of what they meant for his throne, his alliances, his kingdom, his legacy. They came from the place beneath the crown, beneath the title, Beneath every layer of identity that had been built on top of the wolf, who was now standing in a dark forest with blood on his claws and the absolute crystalline certainty that the entire system he had been raised to serve was rotten at its foundation, and the only way forward was through its wreckage. Lyra watched him. The silver light around her pulsed once, slow, deep, the rhythm of recognition rather than power. She did not forgive him. The set of her jaw, the distance in her eyes, the careful space she maintained between his body and hers, none of that had changed. But something else had shifted. Something in the way she looked at him now held a fraction less contempt and a fraction more of that terrible, exhausting emotion that survivors carry when they recognize another survivor. Not trust, not love, not anything as clean as either of those words, but the grudging acknowledgement that the person standing next to you has finally stopped pretending and started bleeding for real. "Ashar's gate," she said. "Now." They ran. Behind them, Marin's voice followed through the dark trees, not shouting, not threatening, but calm, certain, inevitable. "The great houses will come, Draven, and when they do, you will have to choose between your crown and your conscience. No wolf has ever survived that choice." He did not answer. He did not have to. The choice was already made. Had been made the moment he drove his claws into the first soldier and felt the last piece of the king he used to be fall away like dead skin. He was something else now. Something without a name or a precedent or a throne to sit on. Something that had been forged in the space between betrayal and recognition, hammered into shape by the impact of every lie he had swallowed and every truth he had failed to see. The forest thinned, the ridge rose ahead of them, black against the bleeding sky. And at its crest, Ashar's gate pulsed with dark energy. The ancient stone circle cracked wide open, columns of shadow pouring upward into the wound in the sky, the breach point where the veil between worlds had been torn apart by the very ritual designed to save it. Lyra stopped running. Her eyes locked on the gate, and the silver light inside her surged. Not flickering now, but steady, building, gathering itself for something immense. The goddess memories were accelerating. She could feel the shape of the seal in her mind, could feel exactly where it had broken and exactly how to mend it, and the knowledge was beautiful and terrible and demanding in equal measure because restoring the seal would require pouring her own essence into the breach the same way the original goddess had done 7 centuries ago. The same way. The same cost. The same burning. She looked at her hands. The calloused, scarred, herb-stained hands of a healer from a border pack that no longer existed, and she understood with absolute clarity that the woman those hands belonged to might not survive what came next. Draven stood beside her, bleeding, blistered, stripped of every title and alliance and illusion he had carried into this night. He looked at the gate. He looked at her. And in his silver eyes she saw the question he would not ask, because he had lost the right to ask her anything. "I am not doing this for you," she said. "I am not doing this for the kingdom. I am doing this because there are children in that city who are screaming in their sleep, and I am a healer, and that is what healers do." We walked toward the wound. She walked toward Ashar's gate. The silver light blazed. The shadow beast roared in the distance, closer now, the royal guard's 20 minutes almost spent. And Draven followed, not as a king, not as a mate, not as anything he had been before tonight, but as the only wolf left standing between her and every conspiracy, every assassin, every great house that wanted her dead. The gate opened its darkness like a mouth. Lyra stepped into it, and the ground beneath them began to scream. The ground screamed the way wounded animals scream, not with voice but with vibration, a frequency that traveled up through boot leather and bone and settled in the jaw like a second pulse. The stone circle of Ashar's gate was alive. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but in the raw biological sense. The ancient megaliths were pulsing, contracting, expanding in rhythms that matched no heartbeat Draven had ever felt, and the runes carved into their surfaces were bleeding light the color of infected wounds, amber and sickly green and a deep bruised violet that hurt to look at directly. Lyra walked into the center of the circle and the screaming stopped, cut off mid-frequency like a throat being closed. The silence that replaced it was worse, a held-breath silence, the silence of something enormous becoming aware that it was no longer alone. The breach in the veil hung above the stone circle like a vertical ocean, a wall of roiling darkness that stretched from the ground to the wound in the sky, and through it Draven could see, or his wolf could see, or something deeper than either could see, shapes moving. Not the shadow beast. Other things. Older things. An entire ecosystem of darkness pressed against the thinning membrane between their world and whatever existed on the other side. Lyra raised her hands. The silver light that had been flickering and surging for the last hour steadied into something focused, something with architecture. Beams of luminescence extending from her palms toward the breach like the skeletal framework of a structure being built in real time. The goddess memories were fully integrated now. She was not remembering how to seal the veil. She was the memory. 7 centuries of dormant knowledge flowing through her nervous system like current through copper wire, burning as it went, reshaping her from the inside out. Her nose bled. A single line of bright red cutting down her upper lip, across her chin, dropping onto the stone beneath her feet. Then her ears. Then the corners of her eyes, not tears, blood, the physical cost of channeling power that was never meant to flow through mortal tissue, through veins and capillaries built for a healer's quiet life, rather than a goddess's apocalyptic work. Draven saw the blood, and his wolf nearly broke free. The mate bond was screaming at him, a continuous, high-pitched frequency of alarm that drowned out thought and strategy and everything except the primal, marrow-deep imperative to reach her, to stop whatever was hurting her, to put his body between her and the thing that was making her bleed. But he could not stop this. He could not fight this. The thing hurting her was the power she needed to save the world, and intervening now would be like pulling a surgeon's hands away mid-operation because you could not stand the sight of the incision. So he did the only thing left. He turned his back to her and faced outward, toward the tree line, toward the darkness, toward every threat that might come from the physical world while she fought the metaphysical one. He planted his feet on the screaming ground and let his claws extend fully. All 10, black and curved, the killing implements of an alpha bloodline that had held territory for 700 years through violence so effective it had become institutional. And he waited. He did not wait long. The first wave came from the forest. Not the shadow beast, smaller fragments of it, pieces that had broken off from the main body like sparks from a fire, each one the size of a large wolf, and moving with the jerky, stop-motion speed of things that did not obey the normal rules of momentum. They had no shape. They were holes in the world, moving voids that consumed everything they touched. Leaves, branches, the ground itself vanishing into their boundaries with a soft hissing sound that was somehow more disturbing than any roar. Draven counted 7, then 12. Then he stopped counting because counting implied a mathematical framework that this situation had abandoned entirely. The first shadow fragment reached the edge of the stone circle and slammed into an invisible barrier. The residual energy of the ancient seal, still clinging to the megalith like the last threads of a fraying rope. The fragment recoiled, tried again. The barrier held, but Draven could see the strain in it. Hairline fractures of light appearing in the air itself, spreading like cracks in thin ice. Lyra. How long? Her answer came through clenched teeth, through blood and pain and the immense effort of holding a collapsing universe together with borrowed divinity. I do not know. Minutes. The seal it is more damaged than I expected. The original was built over days. I am rebuilding it in real time while the breach is active. The barrier around the circle is failing. I know. When it fails, they come through. I know. Can you seal the veil and maintain the barrier simultaneously? The silence that followed was all the answer he needed. The barrier cracked. A shadow fragment punched through and hit the stone floor of the circle, and where it landed, the ancient rock dissolved into nothing. A hole in the ground, perfectly round, perfectly black, extending downward into an absence so complete it made Draven's inner ear rebel and his sense of balance tilt sideways. He was on it before it could expand, driving his claws into the stone on either side of it and channeling his alpha's power, the territorial force, the dominion energy that every ruling alpha carried as a birthright, directly into the ground. It was not a seal. It was not even close. It was a wolf pissing on a boundary line and daring the universe to cross it. And it should not have worked except that territorial power was one of the oldest forces in the wolf world, and old forces, he was learning tonight, carried weight that newer magic could not match. The hole stopped growing. The shadow fragment writhed inside it, trapped between Draven's territorial claim and the stone it could not consume. Draven held it. His arms shook. His claws sank into rock that should have been harder than his bones, but yielded under the pressure of his will like wet clay, because the ground remembered what it was built for and the Alpha's authority reminded it. A second fragment broke through. A third. The barrier was failing in sections now, collapsing inward like a dam with too many leaks, and Draven could not be everywhere at once. He released the first fragment and threw himself at the nearest intruder, catching it mid-lunge and slamming it into a megalith with enough force to crack the stone. The shadow fragment dispersed not destroyed but scattered, reduced to wisps of darkness that evaporated in the silver light from Lyra's working. But the megalith he had used as a weapon was cracked now, and the runes on its surface flickered and dimmed, and he understood with sickening clarity that using the circle's own stones as weapons was damaging the infrastructure Lyra needed to rebuild the seal. He could fight the fragments and destroy the circle, or he could protect the circle and let the fragments through. There was no third option. There was never a third option. There was only the narrowing corridor between bad and catastrophic, and the question was not which door to walk through, but how much of himself he was willing to leave behind on the threshold. Draven stopped fighting the fragments. He stopped trying to intercept, to block, to destroy. Instead, he ran to the nearest megalith, the tallest one, the anchor stone, the central pillar that the other stones oriented around like planets around a sun, and he pressed his palms flat against its surface and poured every ounce of alpha power he possessed directly into the structure. Not a territorial claim, not a barrier, something deeper, something that wolves did when they were dying and wanted to leave something behind. The final territorial imprint, the death mark, the act of writing your own essence into the land itself so that some part of you remained after the body gave out. It was not supposed to be survivable. Wolves who performed the death mark burned through their own life force in minutes. It was a last resort, a terminal act, the biological equivalent of pulling the pin on your own existence and using the detonation to buy time for others. Draven knew this. He had watched his uncle perform it during the Grey Peak siege 20 years ago, had watched the old Alpha's hair go white in 30 seconds, had watched his skin thin and his eyes dim and his body cave inward like a structure losing its supports one by one until there was nothing left but a shell and a territory. Claims so powerful that the enemy forces could not cross the boundary line for 3 days after his death. He was not his uncle. He did not have 3 days. He did not have 30 seconds. But the power that poured from his palms into the megalith was real. He could feel it leaving him like heat, leaving a body in winter, feel his muscles weakening, feel his vision narrowing at the edges as his life force transferred from his blood into the stone. The megalith blazed. The runes on its surface ignited with new intensity, and the cracks in the barrier stopped spreading, and for one suspended moment the entire stone circle hummed with the combined energy of the ancient seal and a wolf king burning himself alive to keep it intact. Lyra felt it through the bond, the sudden drain, the life force hemorrhaging out of Draven's body and into the stone. She did not turn around, could not turn around, not with the seal half rebuilt and the breach still gaping and 7 centuries of accumulated damage demanding her attention in every direction simultaneously. But she felt him diminishing behind her the way you feel a fire dying in a room, the warmth withdrawing, the shadows getting longer. "What are you doing?" she said. "Buying time." "You are killing yourself." "I am aware." "Stop. Finish the seal." "Draven, stop. The death mark will consume you before I can..." "Then work faster." The rawness in his voice stopped her argument dead. Not authority, not the commanding tone of a king giving orders. Something stripped below that. The voice of a man who had made his calculation and found the sum acceptable. The voice that wolves used when they had already crossed the line between living and sacrificing, and there was no coming back across it. She had heard that voice before. She had heard it in the healer's cottage, from wolves whose wounds were fatal and who had stopped asking her to save them and started asking her to make sure their pups knew they had stood. Her hands shook. The silver light flickered. and the goddess inside her, that ancient, vast, centuries-old consciousness that cared about seals and balances and the mathematical precision of cosmic architecture, slammed against the healer who cared about one wolf burning behind her and demanded she focus. She focused. The seal structure grew faster now, each luminous beam snapping into place with a precision that was not human, that came from somewhere older than humanity, from a time when the rules of the world were written by hands that understood the engineering of reality at a level no mortal mind could fully process. The breach began to narrow. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the wall of darkness contracted, the membrane between worlds thickening as Lyra poured her essence into its reconstruction. The shadow fragments intensified, dozens now, swarming the barrier, hammering at the reinforced perimeter with a frenzy that spoke of intelligence. The main beast, wherever it was, had sensed what was happening and was sending its extensions to stop it. The barrier held. Draven's death mark held, but the cost was visible. His hair was graying at the temples. His skin had gone pale and tight over his bones, and his hands, where they pressed against the megalith, had gone from burned to translucent, the veins visible beneath tissue-thin skin like a map of diminishing time. A sound from the tree line. Not shadow fragments, something heavier, physical. The thud of boots on packed earth, the clink of moon silver, the organized rhythm of soldiers moving in formation. Draven turned his head. The movement cost him, every small motion now drawing from a reservoir that was nearly empty, and through dimming vision he saw them emerge from the forest. Marin's reinforcements. Not 12 this time. 40. Maybe 50. Full-armored company, moon-silver weapons gleaming, advancing on the stone circle with the disciplined pace of wolves who had been told that the fate of the great houses depended on what happened in the next 5 minutes. At their center, carried on a field litter by 4 soldiers, was a weapon Draven recognized from the old texts. A moon-silver lance, 8 feet long, etched with disruption runes, designed specifically for the purpose of shattering divine energy constructs. A goddess killer. They had built a goddess killer. He could not fight 50 soldiers. He could barely stand. The death mark had consumed more than half his life force, and what remained was a flickering ember where a furnace had been. Enough to keep his heart beating, enough to keep his eyes open, not enough to cross the distance between the megalith and the advancing army. But he could choose where that ember burned. Draven pulled his hands from the megalith. The disconnection was agony, like pulling his own spine out through his palms, every nerve in his body screaming at the severance of the connection he had forged between his essence and the stone. The barrier around the circle flickered dangerously. 2 shadow fragments broke through immediately, hit the stone floor, began dissolving reality in expanding black pools. But Draven was already moving, not toward the fragments, not toward the barrier, but toward the advancing army, toward the moon-silver lance, toward the 50 armed wolves between Lyra and annihilation. He shifted. Not the controlled, strategic shift of a king entering battle. The desperate, bone-cracking shift of a wolf whose human body had nothing left and whose animal form could still run on fumes and fury. His wolf was massive, silver-black, scarred across the muzzle and flanks, the kind of animal that made other wolves lower their eyes on instinct. But tonight it was diminished, thinner, its ribs visible, its fur patchy where the death mark had consumed the vitality from within. It did not matter. The wolf hit the ground running with the concentrated intensity of a creature that had reduced its entire existence to a single purpose and burned away everything else. The first line of soldiers faltered, not from fear of the wolf itself, but from what the wolf represented, their king, their alpha, the center of their dominance hierarchy, charging them in a form that communicated absolute territorial rejection. Half of these wolves had grown up with the Ashthorne howl in their bones. Half of them had sworn oaths on their blood to serve the silver crown. And here was that crown, running at them on 4 legs with death in its eyes, and the deep-coated loyalty that existed below choice and below training and below even self-preservation made their formation stutter. Draven hit the front line like a battering ram. Not to kill, to scatter, to break the formation, to create chaos, to separate the soldiers carrying the moon-silver lance from the soldiers providing cover. His jaws closed on the shaft of the lance, and he wrenched sideways, and the four wolves carrying it stumbled, and one lost her grip, and the lance tipped and struck the ground point first, burying itself 6 inches into the earth. Draven planted himself over it, 4 legs braced, back arched, teeth bared, and dared them to move him. 50 wolves, 1 alpha. The math had not changed, but the equation had, because Draven was no longer calculating survival. He was calculating damage. How many could he take before he fell? How many seconds could he buy? How much chaos could a dying Wolf King create in the gap between standing and gone? Behind him, at the center of the stone circle, Lyra screamed, not in pain, in effort. The seal was closing. She could feel the edges of the breach drawing together, could feel the membrane between worlds thickening under her hands, could feel the goddess power surging through her in waves that were rebuilding the ancient architecture one luminous brick at a time. But the shadow fragments that had broken through the weakened barrier were spreading inside the circle now, dissolving the ground beneath her feet, and the seal was not finished, and Draven's death mark was fading from the megaliths, and the entire structure was collapsing faster than she could rebuild it. She needed more power, more than the goddess blood could provide through her mortal body, more than any single entity could channel without being consumed entirely. She needed the thing that the original moon goddess had used 7 centuries ago, the thing that had burned away her divinity and cast her into the mortal cycle, the total irreversible commitment of self into the seal. Every memory, every identity, every scrap of consciousness poured into the architecture of the barrier between worlds until there was nothing left of the person who had done the pouring. The healer and the goddess fought inside her. The healer, Lyra, the orphan, the woman who had loved a king and been betrayed and had walked to this place on her own 2 legs, wanted to live, wanted to feel sunlight and grind herbs and hear the sound of wolves laughing in the market square. Wanted a future, any future, even one built on the wreckage of everything she had lost. The goddess, ancient, vast, mathematical in her understanding of cosmic necessity, knew that survival was not the variable that mattered. The seal was the variable. The world was the variable. One consciousness weighed against billions of lives, and the equation only solved one way. Lyra closed her eyes. Blood ran from her nose, her ears, the corners of her eyes. The silver light around her blazed to a blinding intensity. At the tree line, Draven stood over the moon-silver lance with his fur matted with blood and his legs shaking and 50 wolves closing in around him. He could feel Lyra through the bond, could feel her making the decision, could feel the exact moment she chose to pour everything she was into the seal, could feel the healer letting go and the goddess taking over and the woman he loved beginning to dissolve. No, he said. The word came out as a growl, then a howl, a sound that started in his chest and tore through his wolf's throat and carried across the stone circle and the battlefield and the bleeding sky with a force that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the raw, unprocessed refusal of a man who had already lost everything and was watching the last thing vanish. No, not like this, not her, not her. He shifted back to human. The transformation was ugly. Bones cracking, joints popping, skin splitting and reforming over a frame that was 30 years older than it had been an hour ago. He stood naked and bleeding in the moonlight with the soldiers frozen around him and the lance at his feet and his eyes. Those Ashthorne silver eyes, dim now, flickering, almost spent, locked on the blazing figure at the center of the stone circle. The bond between them was visible. A silver thread, thinning, fraying, stretching as Lyra poured herself into the seal and left less and less of the woman tethered to the other end. Draven grabbed it, not physically, not with his hands, but with the same force he had used to push through the silver barrier at the amphitheater, with the part of himself that existed below the body and below the wolf and below every constructed identity. He grabbed the bond and he pulled, not to stop her, not to drag her back, but to give her an anchor, a fixed point, something human to tether the healer's consciousness while the goddess did her work, a counterweight against the total dissolution, a reason for Lyra Evermoon to exist as a separate entity within the cosmic architecture she was building. The pull cost him everything he had left. The last reserves of his life force, the deathmark energy still circulating in his blood, the fundamental vitality that kept a wolf's heart beating and a wolf's lungs breathing and a wolf's brain firing in the patterns that constituted consciousness. He fed it all into the bond. He gave her his remaining years, his remaining breaths, the dwindling light behind his silver eyes. Lyra felt it arrive, felt the anchor drop into the center of her dissolving self like a stone into deep water, felt the tether catch, felt herself pulled back from the edge of total dissolution just far enough to maintain the distinction between Lyra and the goddess, between the woman and the power, between the healer who wanted to live and the ancient force that needed to sacrifice. The seal snapped into place. The breach slammed shut with a detonation of silver light that flattened every wolf within a quarter mile and sent a shockwave rippling across the continent. The shadow fragments evaporated. The bleeding sky closed. The megaliths of Ashara's gate blazed white-hot and then went dark, and the runes on their surfaces burned themselves into the stone with a permanence that would last another 7 centuries. Silence. Total, absolute, ringing silence. Then Draven's knees hit the ground. His vision was almost gone, just shapes, shadows, the fading impression of a world he could no longer see clearly. His heart was still beating, but barely, a thin and thready rhythm that a healer would have recognized as the last protests of a body running on nothing. Lyra stood at the center of the sealed circle. The silver light was gone. Her eyes were brown again. Just brown, just Lyra, the goddess power integrated but no longer blazing, settled into her bones like a river returning to its banks after a flood. She was alive. She was whole. The seal was complete, and she was still standing, and the healer and the goddess existed in the same body without consuming each other because a man had given her his remaining life as an anchor, and she had used it. She turned. She saw Draven on the ground. She saw the gray in his hair, the translucence of his skin, the way his silver eyes had gone pale as water. She saw the 50 soldiers standing frozen around him, weapons half raised, staring at their king as he died on his knees. She walked toward him. The soldiers parted, not because she commanded them, because the look on her face, the terrible, complex, unspeakable expression of a woman watching the man who betrayed her finish burning himself to ash in her service, carried an authority that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with witness. She knelt in front of him. His eyes found hers. Barely. "You gave me everything," she said. "Not everything." His voice was a whisper, a scrape, the last sound a fire makes before the coals go cold. "Not enough. Never enough." His eyes closed. His body tilted forward. And Lyra caught him, caught the weight of a dying king in the arms of the woman he had tried to sacrifice. And the sound that came from her throat was not a scream and not a sob, but something between, something that belonged to the specific agony of holding someone you have every right to hate and discovering that the hatred is not the loudest thing inside you. Around them, the 50 soldiers of the great houses lowered their weapons, not in surrender, in recognition. The moon-silver lance lay forgotten in the dirt, and above them, where the bleeding sky had been, the moon, clean, white, whole, unmarked by crimson, hung in silence over a world that had survived its own ending. But Draven's heart was barely beating, and the power that had saved the seal, his life force, his remaining years, his everything, was gone, poured into a bond that had served its purpose and now had nothing left to carry. Lyra pressed her hand to his chest. She was a healer. She had spent her life pulling wolves back from the edge. But this was not a wound. This was an absence, a fundamental depletion that existed below the level where medicine or magic could reach, where the only thing that could restore what was lost was the same force that had been used to anchor her, life for life, essence for essence, a transaction so deep it operated at the level where identity and biology were the same thing. She could save him. The goddess power inside her could reverse the death mark, could rebuild what the sacrifice had consumed, could pour vitality back into the empty vessel of a wolf who had burned himself hollow to keep her whole. But the cost? The cost would bind them. Not the mate bond, not the political bond of king and consort, but something older and more permanent, a fusion of essence that would make their lives literally interdependent, two hearts beating with shared blood, two minds anchored in shared consciousness, inseparable in a way that transcended choice or emotion or even forgiveness. She would be saving the man who betrayed her by becoming permanently, irrevocably bound to him. Draven's heartbeat stuttered, skipped, thinned to a thread. Lyra closed her eyes. The moon hung overhead. The sealed veil hummed beneath the earth, and 50 soldiers held their breath while a healer held a dying king, and the entire world waited to find out whether love was the thing that saved them or the thing that burned them down, or both. Her hands began to glow. Her hands glowed, and the light that came from them was not the blazing, impersonal radiance of the goddess. It was smaller, warmer. The soft, steady luminescence of a woman who had spent her entire adult life pressing her palms against damaged flesh and willing it to knit. Healer's light. The first magic Lyra had ever learned, taught to her by a mother who would later be murdered by the very conspiracy that had delivered Lyra to this moment, this man, this impossible choice between justice and mercy on a hilltop where the world had just barely survived its own unmaking. She pressed both hands flat against Draven's chest. His heartbeat was a ghost beneath her fingers, faint, arrhythmic, the cardiac stutter of a body that had poured out its fundamental vitality and was running on the biological equivalent of fumes and muscle memory. His skin was cold. His lips were gray. The silver of his Ashthorne eyes had faded to something closer to smoke, and when he tried to focus on her face, his pupils drifted like a man watching something recede into distance. The goddess power stirred inside her, responding to the proximity of the bond, to the fraying tether between their essences. It offered itself, vast, precise, capable of reversing the death mark with surgical exactitude. But the cost was clear, written in the grammar of forces older than language. To rebuild what Draven had sacrificed, she would have to pour her own essence through the bond. Not power, herself. The transaction would fuse them at a level below choice, below emotion, below the conscious architectures of love and resentment and forgiveness. They would become interdependent in the way that lungs are interdependent with air, not by preference but by biology. She would be choosing to spend the rest of her life tethered to the man who had chained her to an altar. Lyra looked down at his face, studied it the way she had studied 1,000 wounds, clinically, honestly, without the luxury of sentiment. She saw the new lines, the gray at his temples, the translucence of skin stretched over bone that had aged decades in minutes. She saw the cost of what he had done written on his body like a receipt. Every year he had surrendered legible in the erosion of his features, and she understood with the healer's brutal clarity that this was not a man performing sacrifice for spectators. This was the aftermath, the real thing, the ugly, unglamorous math of a body that had given more than it contained and was collapsing under the debt. She could let him die. The thought was not cruel. It was honest. She could pull her hands away and stand up and walk into the new world she had just saved as a goddess, unbound, untethered, free of the man and the kingdom and every thread of the conspiracy that had woven her life into a weapon. She had earned that freedom. She had paid for it in blood and betrayal and the ashes of a childhood that had been stolen to produce this exact result. No one, not the soldiers, not the council, not the memory of her murdered parents, would blame her for choosing herself. Her fingers pressed harder against his chest. His heartbeat fluttered beneath them like a bird trapped under glass. The truth was simpler than freedom and uglier than justice. The truth was that Lyra Evermoon had built her entire identity around one principle. You walk toward the wound. Not because the wound deserves it, not because the wounded person has earned it, because that is what healers do, and if she stopped doing it the moment the wound belonged to someone who had hurt her, then the principle was never real. It was just a convenience she wore until it cost something. It was going to cost everything now. She opened the bond. Not the damaged, fraying thing that Draven had torn with his betrayal, but something beneath it. The original connection. The foundational resonance that had existed between them before politics and prophecy and the machinery of powerful wolves had turned it into a weapon. She found it buried under layers of pain and manipulation and institutional violence, and she cleared the debris the way she cleared infection from a wound, methodically, without gentleness, with the understanding that cleaning something out hurts worse than leaving it in, but is the only path to survival. The goddess power flowed through the opened bond like water through a broken dam. Not a trickle. A torrent. Lyra gasped. The sensation was beyond pain, beyond pleasure, beyond any physical analogy. It was the experience of her own essence leaving her body and entering his, filling the voids the death mark had carved, rebuilding the cellular architecture that his sacrifice had consumed. She could feel his heart strengthening under her hands, could feel the rhythm steadying, deepening, could feel the color returning to his skin and the warmth flooding back into tissue that had gone cold. And she could feel the fusion taking hold, the interdependence, the permanent, irreversible entanglement of two lives at the level where identity and biology were the same thing. Every beat of her heart was now calibrated to his. Every breath she drew carried the echo of his lungs. She would never be free of him. She would never be entirely separate. The tether between them was no longer a thread. It was a root system, deep and spreading and woven into the foundations of who they both were. The cost of mercy. Not a metaphor. A fact. Draven's eyes opened, clear, silver, alive. He looked at Lyra, and the first thing he saw was the blood on her face, the dried rivers from her nose and ears and eyes, and the expression she wore, which was not love and not hatred and not forgiveness, but something he had never seen on another face before. The expression of a woman who had just made the hardest decision of her life and was not going to explain it to anyone, least of all the man it was made for. "You saved me," he said. His voice was raw, new, the voice of a man speaking through a throat that had been rebuilt from the inside out. "I am a healer," Lyra said. "That is all. Do not read more into it than exists." She stood. Her legs trembled, but held. The 50 soldiers of the great houses were still frozen in the clearing around them, weapons lowered, faces caught between shock and something older. The instinctive deference of wolves in the presence of power so fundamental it bypassed politics entirely. The moon-silver lance lay in the dirt. No one moved to pick it up. Lyra looked at them. Every face, every set of eyes, every wolf who had come to this hilltop carrying a weapon built to destroy her. The goddess power inside her was integrated now. Not blazing, not erupting, but settled into her bones like a second skeleton, a permanent architecture of force that would never leave and would never fully sleep. She could have destroyed them, could have turned the moon silver in their hands to slag and the boots on their feet to ash, and the ambitions in their hearts to terror so deep it would reshape their bloodlines for generations. She did not. Not because she was merciful, because destruction was the tool of the system that had created this moment, the system that had killed her parents, engineered her love, chained her to an altar, and built a lance to shatter her when she became inconvenient. Responding with destruction would make her a product of that system. Another weapon. Another instrument of the same violent arithmetic that the great houses had always used to maintain their grip. She was done being an instrument. "Go home," she said. Her voice carried without effort. Not loud, not commanding, but present, occupying the space the way moonlight occupies a room, touching everything without forcing anything. "Tell your houses what you saw tonight. Tell them the veil is sealed, the beast is gone, and the woman they tried to kill is the reason any of you are still breathing. And tell them this: the next time the great houses send wolves to destroy something they do not understand, I will not fight back. I will simply stop protecting them. And then they can negotiate with the darkness on their own." They left. Not running, not fleeing, but walking with the weighted gait of soldiers who had been given a defeat so complete it did not even feel like a battle. One by one they disappeared into the tree line, carrying their weapons and their wounded and the moon-silver lance that would never be used for its intended purpose. Lyra watched them go. Then her legs gave out. Draven caught her. His arms around her were stronger than they should have been, the restored vitality already knitting muscle and bone, the alpha's body reasserting itself with the aggressive healing that all Ashthorne wolves carried as a bloodline trait. He lowered her to the ground and sat beside her, and for a long time neither of them spoke. They just sat on the cold stone of Ashara's gate, while the clean white moon hung above them and the sealed veil hummed beneath the earth like a vast machine running smoothly for the first time in centuries. "I can feel you," Lyra said finally. "Your heartbeat, in my chest, behind my ribs. It is strange. The fusion." Yes. Does it hurt? No, it just exists, like a sound you cannot stop hearing. She was quiet for a moment. I did not save you because I forgive you. I know. I saved you because I refuse to let the worst thing you have ever done be the only thing that defines what happens next. Not for your sake, for mine. If I let you die, I carry that. If I let you die because you hurt me, then the hurt wins, and everything I survived tonight becomes about you instead of about me. Draven absorbed this. The words settled into him not as comfort, but as consequence. The recognition that the woman beside him had chosen to save his life through an act of radical self-determination that had nothing to do with his redemption and everything to do with her refusal to be diminished. She had not rescued him. She had rescued herself from the version of herself that would have let him die. What happens now, he said. Now you face what you did. Not to me. To the kingdom. To the wolves who trusted you. To the families of every guard who died buying us time tonight. You face it publicly. You face it honestly. And you do not hide behind the crown or the prophecy or the word sacrifice to make it sound noble. It was not noble. No, it was not. The walk back to Silverfang City took an hour. They moved slowly. Lyra from exhaustion, Draven from the residual weakness of a body still recalibrating after the death mark reversal. The forest was quiet around them. Not the tense, watched silence of the earlier run, but something gentler. The ambient quiet of a world catching its breath after a near-death experience. Every living thing settling back into its rhythms the way a house settles after a storm. They did not hold hands. They did not walk close enough to touch. The space between them was deliberate, maintained with the careful precision of two people who understood that proximity was no longer something they could afford to be careless about. The bond between them hummed, constant, permanent, inescapable. But the bond was not the relationship. The bond was biology. The relationship was wreckage, and wreckage took longer to clear than one night. Silverfang City was damaged, but standing. The void at the proving grounds had stopped expanding the moment the veil sealed, leaving a circular absence in the center of the amphitheater. A perfectly smooth crater of absolute nothing that would remain as a permanent reminder of how close the world had come to being consumed. Buildings had collapsed, streets were cracked, the eastern wall was half demolished, but wolves were already moving through the rubble, pulling survivors from the debris, carrying the wounded to makeshift healing stations, organizing supply chains and patrol routes, and the thousand small logistics of a community that had looked annihilation in the face and was now doing what communities do after the unthinkable, continuing. Captain Rowan Ashfield met them at what remained of the eastern gate. She was alive, missing the top half of her left ear and carrying her right arm in a sling made from torn fabric, but alive, standing, eyes sharp. 3 of her royal guards stood behind her. Out of the original 20 who had charged the Shadow Beast, 3 remained. The beast, Draven said, dissolved when the veil sealed, came apart like smoke in a hard wind, took 8 of mine with it before it went. Rowan's voice was clipped, professional, the voice of a soldier delivering a casualty report. Another 9 lost in the amphitheater collapse. We pulled Fenric from the rubble an hour ago, alive, Sarath as well. We have them in custody. Good. The council is demanding a session. Every lord and lady who survived the night wants answers, and most of them want someone to blame. They can blame me, Draven said. They would be right to. Rowan studied him for a long moment. This diminished, aged, stripped-down version of the king she had served for a decade. Whatever she saw in his face made her nod once, the tight, minimal nod of a wolf who recognized something genuine and was willing to extend exactly one chance on the strength of it. The council convenes at dawn, she said. I would suggest arriving with more than an apology. He arrived with nothing but the truth. The council chamber was half destroyed, one wall gone entirely, open to the morning sky and the smell of smoke and wet stone. 14 seats around the obsidian table and only 9 occupied. 5 lords had been killed in the chaos, their houses now leaderless, their territories unmoored. The survivors sat in ash-dusted clothing with bruises and bandages, and the hollow-eyed look of wolves who had seen the architecture of their world crack open and were not yet sure it would hold. Draven stood at the head of the table. He did not sit. The crown was not on his head. He had left it in the ruins of the throne room, buried under rubble he had not bothered to clear. Fenric and Sarath manipulated the prophecy, he said. They engineered the ritual to awaken a dormant power in my mate, not to seal the darkness. Lady Maren Duskwield provided material support, including the assassination of Lyra's parents to manufacture her isolation. My father was aware of elements of the conspiracy, and I was the mechanism. The fool king who loved a woman he was groomed to love and sacrificed her when the people he trusted told him it was necessary. He laid it out without embellishment, every detail, every failure of judgment, every moment he had chosen obedience over instinct, every second he had spent searching for alternatives while knowing in the quietest part of himself that he had already made the decision. He did not soften it. He did not frame it. He stood in the wreckage of his own authority and let the council see exactly what a king looked like when the crown was removed and the man beneath it was held accountable. Lord Brennan Greymaw spoke first. His voice was quieter than it had been 9 days ago when he had slammed his fist on this same table and demanded the ritual proceed. His daughters were alive. The nightmares had stopped. The cost of that survival was a debt he had not expected to feel so heavily. What do you propose? Fenric, Sarath, and Maren face public tribunal for conspiracy, murder, and treason against the crown. Their houses are dissolved. Their territories revert to the kingdom for redistribution. Draven paused. And I stepped down. The silence that followed was immense. Not from the kingdom, he continued, from unilateral authority. The crown will be restructured, a governing council with binding authority. Not advisory, not decorative, but real. The alpha leads, the council checks. No single wolf, including me, will ever again hold enough unchallenged power to sacrifice an innocent on the word of an advisor and a scroll. You are dismantling your own throne. I am dismantling the system that allowed everything that happened tonight. If the great houses want a king who can be manipulated into butchering his own mate on a stone altar, they can find another bloodline. If they want a kingdom that survives what is coming, because something is always coming, they can build one where the power is distributed enough that no single point of corruption can bring the whole structure down. The council debated. They argued. They raged and postured and threatened and eventually, exhausted and frightened and staring at the gap in the wall where the morning light poured in over a damaged city that needed rebuilding more than it needed politics, they agreed. Not unanimously, not gracefully, but they agreed because the alternative was pretending that the old system had not just nearly destroyed them, and the rubble around their feet made that pretense impossible to maintain. Lyra was not at the council session. She was in what remained of the healer's quarter, treating the wounded. 67 wolves had been pulled from the rubble overnight. Another 40 had been brought in from the eastern villages with injuries sustained during the shadow fragment attacks. Her hands, those calloused, scarred, herb-stained hands that now carried the integrated power of a dormant goddess, moved over torn flesh and broken bone with the same steady, unhurried competence they had always carried. She did not use the divine power. Not for this. She used willow bark and clean bandages and the simple, ancient technology of a healer who understood that most wounds did not need cosmic intervention. They needed clean cloth, steady hands, and someone willing to sit with the pain long enough for the body to remember how to fix itself. A young wolf, the boy from her cottage, the one who had been screaming about shadows, sat on a bench near the door, wrapped in a blanket, eating bread with the slow, dazed appetite of someone returning to the world after a long absence. The nightmares were gone. His eyes were clear. When Lyra passed him, he reached out and caught her sleeve. "You are the one," he said. The one who stopped it. I am the one who is telling you to finish that bread and drink water before you dehydrate, Lyra said. The rest is just a story people will tell. She found Draven in the evening, standing at the edge of the crater where the proving grounds had been. The void had stabilized, a smooth, circular depression in the earth 20 feet across, perfectly black, perfectly still, like a lake made of absolute nothing. The amphitheater walls still stood around it, cracked and leaning but upright. And in the fading light, the whole scene had the look of a monument, not built by intention, but by consequence, a permanent scar in the landscape where the world had almost ended. Draven did not turn when she approached. He could feel her through the bond, her footsteps, her breathing, the steady rhythm of her heart that was now synchronized with his in a way that would never change. Two hearts, one rhythm, the permanent consequence of mercy given at a cost beyond calculation. The council accepted the restructuring, he said. I heard. Fenric and Sarath will stand trial, Marin as well. The evidence from the archives is comprehensive. They will not walk free. Good. Silence. The kind of silence that exists between two people who have too much to say and no words adequate to carry it. I do not know how to do this, Draven said. His voice was quiet. Not the commanding register of a king or the broken rasp of the man who had burned on the hilltop. Something in between. Something new. I do not know how to be the man who did what I did and also be the man standing next to you. I do not know how to carry both of those things in the same body. Lyra stood beside him, looking at the void. The crater where wolves had been crowned and wolves had been executed, and where she had been chained to an altar by the man she loved. The scar in the earth was ugly and permanent and impossible to ignore, and she thought that was appropriate because some things should not be covered over or smoothed away. Some things should stay visible, not as punishment, but as record. Not so the wound keeps hurting, but so no one forgets the shape of what caused it. You carry them the same way I do, she said, one day at a time, without pretending they fit together neatly, without asking the broken pieces to look like something whole. She turned to face him, her brown eyes, steady, clear, ancient with the weight of everything she now carried, met his silver ones. I am not your redemption, Draven. I am not your proof that it all worked out. I am a woman who survived what you did to me and chose to keep surviving in the same world as you. That is not forgiveness. That is endurance, and it is the only thing I can offer right now. It is enough, he said. It will have to be. The coronation happened 3 weeks later. Not in the proving grounds, those belonged to the crater now, to the memory of what the kingdom had nearly become. The ceremony took place in the open air, on the steps of Silver Fang Keep, with the city still under reconstruction around them, and the sounds of hammers and saws, and the organized chaos of rebuilding providing a soundtrack that Lyra thought was more honest than any formal music could have been. She was crowned not as queen consort, that title belonged to a system they had dismantled, but as the Eternal Moon Guardian, a position written into the new charter with powers and responsibilities that existed parallel to the crown rather than beneath it. She would steward the veil. She would oversee the kingdom's relationship with the forces that existed beyond the mundane, and she would hold a permanent seat on the governing council with authority equal to the king's, a structural check against the concentration of power that had made everything possible. Draven placed the circlet on her head, a simple band of moon silver, forged from the chains that had once bound her to the altar, recast by her own hands in the healer's forge. The symbolism was deliberate and unhidden. The metal that had been used to bind her was now the metal that marked her authority. The weapon had become the crown. The cage had become the throne. She looked out at the gathered wolves, 10,000 faces, more, spilling down the steps and into the streets and filling every rooftop and balcony within sight of the keep. They were bruised and tired and scared and rebuilding, and they looked at her not with worship or awe, but with something more useful. Recognition. The acknowledgement that the woman standing before them had walked through the worst thing their kingdom could do and had come out the other side carrying not vengeance, but a blueprint for something better. Draven stood beside her, not behind, not in front, beside. The space between them was still measured, still careful, still carrying the weight of everything that had happened and everything that had not yet been repaired. But the bond hummed between them, steady, permanent, alive. And in its vibration was the quiet promise that survival was not an ending, it was a starting position. The place where you stood after the fire went out and began the slow, unglamorous, necessary work of deciding what to build on ground that had been burned clean. The moon rose over Silver Fang City, white, whole, sealed, and below it, a healer and a king stood together in the ruins of everything they had been, and began the work of becoming something they had not yet named. Not lovers, not enemies, not the fairy tale ending that the old stories promised, but two damaged wolves who had survived each other in the world, and were choosing, day by day, breath by breath, to see if what remained was strong enough to hold. It was not a love story. Not yet. Not anymore. It was something harder and rarer and more honest than love. The slow, deliberate construction of trust from the raw materials of betrayal, built by hands that knew exactly how much it cost to break something and were finally, carefully, learning what it took to build. The moon held its silence. The veil held its seal. And the kingdom, scarred and restructured and stripped of every comfortable illusion about power and sacrifice and the arithmetic of acceptable losses, held its breath and stepped into the first morning of a world that had chosen, against every precedent and every instinct, to be better than the one that came before.